The day started like any other. The sun rising over my modest ranch, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I was out with my coffee, watching my horses graze, enjoying the quiet solitude that comes with living a little off the beaten path. This peace, however, was about to be shattered in a way I could never have imagined. Before I even finished my first cup, the tranquility of my morning was obliterated by the sound of 100 cars, horns blaring, pulling onto my property. Not just my driveway, mind you, but spreading out across my carefully maintained pasture, threatening to turn my lush green into a muddy, tire-marked wasteland. I watched, dumbfounded, as people in their finest attire, carrying gift bags and floral arrangements, started spilling out, chattering excitedly. They weren't lost tourists, nor were they some unexpected delivery. No, they were clearly guests, and by the looks of it, guests for a full-blown wedding. A wedding that, to my absolute astonishment, was being set up on my land, without a single word to me. And right there, in the center of it all, directing the chaos with the self-important air of a queen overseeing her dominion, was Brenda, or as she was more commonly known around our small tight-knit community, the HOA Karen. You see, our neighborhood, while boasting larger lots and a more rural feel, still had an HOA. An HOA that, thanks to Brenda's relentless meddling and seemingly infinite free time, had become less about maintaining property values and more about controlling every breath we took. Brenda, with her perpetually pursed lips and an unshakable belief in her own omnipotence, had made it her life's mission to dictate the lives of everyone in the community. She was the self-appointed arbiter of taste, the enforcer of rules, even those that didn't exist, and the undisputed champion of turning minor infractions into full-blown international incidents. She had a way of making even the most mundane interactions feel like a federal indictment. Her voice a shrill siren that could cut through any attempt at rational discourse. Her favorite tactic was to quote obscure, often entirely fabricated, clauses from the HOA bylaws, her finger wagging like a conductor's baton, daring anyone to question her authority. I'd had my fair share of run-ins with her, mostly over trivial things like the height of my fence or the color of my mailbox, all of which I'd brushed off with a polite but firm dismissal. I was a man who valued his independence, a trait that Brenda, with her insatiable need for control, found utterly anathema. She saw my quiet self-sufficiency not as a virtue but as a challenge, a sign that I wasn't adequately respecting her authority. But this was beyond anything I could have imagined. This wasn't a fence dispute. This was an invasion. A full-scale, uninvited 200-person wedding invasion. I watched, my blood pressure slowly climbing, as catering trucks pulled up, tents began to rise, and a makeshift stage, complete with a floral arch, started to take shape right in the middle of my favorite grazing pasture. My horses, bless their patient souls, were already looking agitated, moving uneasily away from the encroaching spectacle. The audacity of it, the sheer unmitigated gall, was breathtaking. I mean, who does that? Who plans a wedding on someone else's private property without so much as a knock on the door, let alone permission? It was a level of entitlement that bordered on the pathological. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm brewing inside me. I was a calm man, a patient man, but even a saint has his limits. And Brenda, with her perpetual need to overstep every boundary imaginable, was rapidly pushing me towards mine. I finished my coffee, the lukewarm liquid doing little to soothe my rising anger. This wasn't just about my property anymore. This was about respect. This was about principle, and this was about to become a confrontation Brenda would never forget. I walked deliberately, my boots crunching on the gravel, towards the epicenter of the chaos, where Brenda, in a ridiculously flamboyant hat, was gesticulating wildly at a team of bewildered caterers. As I approached, I could hear snippets of her conversation. Her voice, already naturally piercing, amplified by her excitement. "No, no, darling, the champagne flutes go here. We want a clear view of the mountain range for the toasts. Absolutely. It's spectacular, don't you think?" She giggled, a sound that grated on my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. She was oblivious to my presence, too caught up in her self-created fantasy. I cleared my throat, a deliberate, resonant sound designed to cut through the din. She flinched, turning slowly, her smile freezing on her face as her eyes landed on me. The color drained from her cheeks, replaced by a ghastly pallor. For once, Brenda was speechless. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. "Brenda," I said, my voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the cacophony around us. "What in the blazes do you think you're doing?" Her mouth opened and closed a few times, like a fish out of water. She finally managed to stammer, Oh, Mr. Peterson, fancy meeting you here." She tried to feign surprise, but her eyes darted nervously around, betraying her. It was pathetic. "Really? Fancy meeting me here?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "Brenda, you are currently hosting what appears to be a 200-person wedding on my private property, without my permission. What in the actual hell is going on?" She straightened her shoulders, a flicker of her usual self-important defiance returning. "Now, Mr. Peterson, there's no need for such language. It's perfectly fine. I spoke to the HOA board. They said it was permissible. I stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. You spoke to the HOA board? Brenda, the HOA has absolutely no jurisdiction over my private property for something like this. This isn't a communal park. This is my ranch, my home. She waved a dismissive hand. Oh, details. It's for my niece, you see, a truly lovely girl. And this spot, with its breathtaking views, was just perfect. The city park was booked solid, and honestly it just doesn't have the same rustic charm. My ranch, being trampled by her ridiculous spectacle, was now reduced to rustic charm in her entitled little world. I felt a vain throb in my temple. Brenda, I'm going to tell you this once, and I'm going to be very clear. You have exactly 1 hour to get every single person, every tent, every champagne flute, and every last speck of wedding detritus off my property. If not, I'm calling the sheriff, and I'm pressing trespassing charges on every single person here. Her eyes widened in genuine shock. The defiance in her posture crumbled, replaced by a look of sheer panic. You wouldn't dare, she squeaked. Oh, wouldn't I? I said, my voice dangerously calm. Try me, Brenda, try me. I could see the wheels turning in her head. She was used to people caving to her bluster and fabricated authority. But I wasn't caving. Not this time. Not ever. This was my land, my sanctuary, and she had defiled it with her self-serving arrogance. The thought of this entire wedding being packed up in an hour, the bride and groom arriving to find their dream day utterly ruined, was almost too satisfying. But then, a thought struck me. A truly delicious, poetic thought. Brenda had made her bed, and now it was time for her to lie in it. Or, rather, to have it spectacularly unmade. This wasn't just about getting them off my land. This was about a lesson. A powerful, unforgettable lesson. I knew Brenda had put a significant amount of money into this wedding, boasted about it for months. The idea of it all falling apart, publicly and dramatically, was a tempting prospect. But what if there was another way? A way that would hit Brenda where it truly hurt. Her pride, and her meticulously crafted image. I watched as she started to frantically bark orders at the caterers, her voice a little less shrill now, laced with a tremor of fear. She was realizing the gravity of her situation. She was seeing for the first time that I wasn't going to be pushed around. The stage was set, quite literally, for a showdown, and I had a feeling, a very strong feeling, that karma was about to make a house call. This was going to be a day neither I, nor Brenda, nor any of the 200 bewildered wedding guests would ever forget. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around. I've got more wild HOA tales coming your way. Brenda, usually so composed in her tyrannical pronouncements, was a twitching, squawking mess. She flapped her hands at the caterers who looked utterly bewildered, their professional smiles slowly morphing into expressions of confusion and thinly veiled annoyance. Pack it up. Pack it all up now. Now, darling. Faster. We simply must find another venue. I watched, a small, grim smile playing on my lips. It was a good start, but merely having them pack up wasn't enough. Not for Brenda. She needed a more profound, more public comeuppance. My mind, usually focused on the practicalities of ranch life, began to churn with possibilities. I considered my options. Calling the sheriff immediately would get them off my land, no doubt, but it would also lead to a messy, drawn-out affair, involving police reports, potential legal battles, and a whole lot of wasted time. And frankly, it wouldn't be nearly as satisfying. Brenda thrived on conflict, on being the victim, on turning every situation into a grand theatrical performance, where she was the unjustly persecuted heroine. No, I needed something that would disarm her, that would expose her for what she was, not just to me, but to everyone witnessing this colossal debacle. I needed to turn her grand performance into a public humiliation. My gaze drifted to the partially assembled stage, the ornate floral arch, the rows of white chairs already meticulously arranged. It was all so perfect. Perfect for a wedding, yes, but also perfect for a truly spectacular downfall. A mischievous glint entered my eyes. An idea, daring and utterly delicious, began to form. It was risky, yes, but the potential payoff was too good to ignore. Brenda, in her frantic state, finally noticed my continued presence. Well, are you just going to stand there, Mr. Peterson? Or are you going to help? She snapped her voice, still trembling but regaining a hint of its usual bite. Help, I repeated, raising an eyebrow. Brenda, you're the one who decided to host a massive event on my land without asking. I believe the onus of helping falls squarely on your shoulders. She sputtered, completely flustered. But but the guests will be here any moment. My niece, her special day. Indeed, I said, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across my face. And it will be special, Brenda. Very special, just not in the way you intended. I took a step closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. Tell me, Brenna, how much did you brag about this magnificent, rustic wedding venue to all your friends and family? How many times did you tell everyone how you secured this perfect, exclusive spot for your niece? Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion replacing the panic. What are you getting at, Mr. Peterson? Just this, I said. my smile widening. You have two choices. You can either pack up this entire operation, as I initially instructed, and face the humiliation of a ruined wedding for your niece, and the ensuing gossip from all your friends about how you botched her big day. Or, I paused for dramatic effect, leaning in slightly, you can let the wedding proceed. Brenda's jaw dropped. Let it proceed, but ... but you said ... double quotes, but there's a catch, Brenda, a rather significant one. If you choose to proceed, this wedding will go forward, but under my terms, and those terms, Brenda, will be public. Her eyes darted from me to the half-finished stage, then to the arriving guests who were now beginning to mill about, looking increasingly confused. The bride and groom, beaming and oblivious, were just pulling up in a vintage car. This was my moment. You see, Brenda, I continued, pressing my advantage, I'm a simple man, but I believe in justice, and I believe in transparency. If you want to use my property, Brenda, you're going to have to acknowledge, publicly, that you did so without my permission, that you acted with incredible arrogance and disregard, and that you are, in fact, a trespasser on my land, and you will make a public apology to me, right there, on that stage, before the ceremony even begins. Brenda's face contorted through a range of emotions: disbelief, outrage, humiliation, and finally, a dawning realization of her predicament. The alternative, a completely ruined wedding for her niece, would be a public relations nightmare. For her, perhaps even worse than a public apology. Her image, her carefully cultivated persona as the benevolent, all-knowing HOA queen, would be shattered. This was a direct assault on her most vulnerable point, her pride. An apology, she choked out, as if the word itself tasted like poison. On stage, in front of everyone. Precisely, I said, my tone unwavering. And I'll be right there standing beside you, to make sure you get every word right. And if you refuse, Brenda, then the sheriff will be here within the hour, and this wedding will be shut down. Right now, your choice. I watched her, waiting. She looked like a trapped animal, desperate for an escape route that simply didn't exist. The guests were now fully assembled, murmuring amongst themselves, some pointing at me, others at the frantic Brenda. The bride, looking radiant, was being escorted by her father towards the makeshift aisle, her smile starting to waver as she sensed the tension. The clock was ticking. Brenda had to make a decision, and she had to make it fast. The pressure was immense, and I could see the internal battle raging within her. Her need to save face, to maintain her carefully constructed facade, was warring with her utter contempt for admitting fault. But the stakes were too high, even for her. Her niece's wedding, the culmination of months of planning and boasting, was on the line. And I knew, deep down, that despite her monstrous ego, she wouldn't truly sacrifice her niece's happiness for her own pride. Not completely, anyway. She took a ragged breath, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Fine, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Fine. But you won't make it too humiliating, will you? I allowed myself a small, triumphant smirk. Brenda, I said, my voice kind but firm, that's entirely up to you. The more sincere the apology, the less dramatic the outcome. She shot me a venomous glare, but there was no fire behind it, only resignation. The battle wasn't over, but the first major skirmish had been won, and I had a feeling, as the bride and groom exchanged nervous glances and the guests whispered, excitedly, that this wedding was about to become the most talked about event in the history of our small community, not for its beauty, but for its utterly unbelievable and hilariously public display of HOA Karen karma. The stage was indeed set, not just for a wedding, but for Brenda's very own personal reckoning, and I, for one, couldn't wait for the curtain to rise. The air was thick with anticipation. The guests, initially confused, were now fully aware that something was amiss. The nervous whispers had escalated to outright murmurs, and all eyes were fixed on the makeshift stage where Brenda, looking utterly miserable, stood beside me. The bride and groom, now at the front of the makeshift aisle, were exchanging frantic, worried glances, their expressions shifting from hopeful anticipation to bewildered apprehension. This was not how they envisioned their grand entrance. I had given Brenda a few minutes to compose herself, if such a thing was even possible for her in this situation. She had tried to argue, to negotiate, to find any loophole, but I had held firm. My terms were non-negotiable. She had to apologize, publicly and sincerely, for her egregious act of trespass and entitlement. As the makeshift orchestra began to play a soft romantic tune, I stepped forward, taking the microphone from a bewildered sound technician. The music faded, and a hush fell over the assembled crowd. This was it. Good afternoon, everyone, I began, my voice clear and resonating. Across the field, I saw Brenda flinch beside me, her jaw clenched so tight I thought it might shatter. My name is Mr. Peterson, and I am the owner of this property, this ranch, that you all are currently standing on. A ripple of confused murmurs went through the crowd. I could see some of the guests looking around, realizing they weren't in a public park, but on private land. Brenda let out a small, strangled gasp, and while I am pleased that Brenda has chosen my beautiful ranch for her niece's special day, I continued, a hint of irony in my voice. I must, for the record, state that this entire event has been organized and set up without my knowledge, and more importantly, without my express permission." The murmurs grew louder, turning into shocked gasps. Faces in the crowd registered a mixture of surprise, indignation, and a growing understanding of the absurdity of the situation. Some looked towards Brenda, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and dawning recognition of her typical antics. Brenda, as some of you may know, is a very proactive member of our local homeowners association, I said, pausing slightly for emphasis. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd as some of the long-suffering neighbors recognized the euphemism. Brenda's face was beet red, her eyes narrowed to slits, and in her enthusiasm to secure a perfect venue for her niece, I continued, "She appears to have entirely bypassed the simple courtesy of asking the property owner, namely, me." I turned to Brenda, a calm, unwavering gaze fixed on her. "Brenda, you have something you'd like to say to everyone, don't you?" She stood frozen for a moment, like a deer caught in headlights. Her carefully constructed facade of control was crumbling, brick by excruciating brick. The silence stretched thick with tension. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she weighed her options. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of her entire misguided life, she snatched the microphone from my hand, her grip trembling. All right, fine," she shrieked, her voice cracking. Yes, I, Brenda Higgins, did not, technically, get permission from Mr. Peterson to host this wedding here." Her voice was shrill, laced with a mixture of anger, frustration, and a forced theatricality. I thought it would be fine. It's such a lovely spot, and my niece, Tiffany, deserved the best. The city park was just so common, and frankly, Mr. Peterson rarely uses this particular pasture, so I assumed it wouldn't be an issue. Her attempt to deflect blame and justify her actions was painfully transparent. A few more chuckles, this time louder, spread through the crowd. I remained silent, my arms crossed, my expression neutral. She was digging her own grave, and I was just providing the shovel. And I apologized to Mr. Peterson for the oversight. She spat out the words as if they were poison, clearly struggling to maintain any semblance of dignity. "It was an honest mistake." I slowly raised an eyebrow. "An honest mistake." Brenda, with 200 guests, caterers, and a full stage set up. Brenda's eyes flashed with anger, but she bit back whatever retort was on the tip of her tongue. She knew I had her. "Yes, a mistake," she practically screamed, her voice reaching a crescendo. "I am sorry for the inconvenience. Mr. Peterson there, are you happy now?" I took the microphone back, a small, knowing smile on my face. "Brenda, true apologies come from the heart, not from a hostage negotiation. However, given the circumstances, I appreciate your candor." I turned back to the crowd. "Despite this rather unconventional start and Brenda's somewhat coerced apology," I said, a wave of laughter rippling through the guests, "I have agreed to allow the wedding to proceed. After all, it's not the bride and groom's fault that their aunt has a unique approach to event planning." The bride and groom, who had been standing wide-eyed and mortified throughout Brenda's confession, finally started to relax, a hesitant smile appearing on Tiffany's face. The guests, now fully invested in this bizarre spectacle, cheered. "However," I continued, raising a hand to quiet the applause, "Brenda has also agreed to a small contribution, shall we say, to the general upkeep of this property, given the considerable disruption and wear and tear on my pasture." Brenda gasped, her eyes bulging. I saw her lips move, likely cursing my name, but no sound came out. "We'll discuss the specifics later, Brenda," I said, cutting off any potential protest. "But for now, let's get this wedding started, shall we?" I handed the microphone back to the officiant who, looking utterly shell-shocked but game, began the ceremony. The wedding proceeded, albeit with an undercurrent of bewildered amusement. Guests frequently glanced over at Brenda, who stood rigidly at the back, her face a mask of simmering fury and mortification. Her grand entrance, her carefully planned role as the magnificent hostess, had been utterly hijacked. She was no longer the star of the show, she was the unwitting punchline. During the reception, I saw Brenda trying to mingle, forcing strained smiles, but it was clear her usual charm had evaporated. People were polite, but their eyes held a distinct twinkle of amusement, and I overheard snippets of conversations. Can you believe it? Only Brenda serves her right. The most satisfying moment came later, when I saw the bride, Tiffany, approach me. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "I am so sorry about all this. Aunt Brenda, she just gets carried away." "No worries, dear," I said, giving her a reassuring smile. "It's your day." And honestly, it made for quite a story, didn't it? She giggled a genuine joyful sound. "It certainly did. Thank you for being so understanding, and thank you for letting us stay." "My pleasure," I said. "Just make sure Brenda understands that next time, a simple phone call will suffice, and perhaps a nice bottle of whiskey, as a token of goodwill." Tiffany laughed again, a sound that brought a warmth to my heart. Brenda's humiliation, while sweet, was not the ultimate goal. The goal was to teach her a lesson, to make her understand that boundaries exist and that common decency trumps self-importance every single time. As the evening wore on and the stars began to dot the vast rural sky, I watched the dancing and celebration. The wedding, despite its rocky start, had turned into a truly memorable event, not because of Brenda's grand plans, but because of the sheer unexpected drama that had unfolded. And I had a feeling that the story of the Peterson Ranch wedding crashers would be told for years to come. But the night wasn't over. Brenda had made her public apology, yes, but the matter of the contribution and the broader implications of her actions were still hanging in the air. I knew Brenda wouldn't let this go easily. Her pride was wounded, and a wounded Karen is a dangerous Karen. I had a feeling the fallout from this little incident was far from over, and that Brenda would be plotting her revenge. And I, for one, was ready for her. The morning after the wedding, the ranch was eerily quiet, save for the faint sounds of a cleanup crew meticulously dismantling the remnants of the unauthorized celebration. The tents were coming down, the chairs were stacked, and the floral arch was being carefully loaded onto a truck. Brenda, surprisingly, was nowhere to be seen. I figured she was too embarrassed to face me, or anyone, after her spectacular public comeuppance. The cleanup, however, was just the beginning. The pasture, while not utterly destroyed, bore the clear marks of 200 pairs of feet, heavy equipment, and a general disregard for its natural state. It would take time and money to restore it to its former pristine condition. My agreement with Brenda was clear. She owed me for the damages and the intrusion. The exact amount, however, remained to be negotiated. I expected a fight, of course. Brenda wasn't one to simply open her purse strings without a battle, even when clearly in the wrong. My phone rang late that afternoon. It was Brenda, her voice tight with suppressed fury. "Mr. Peterson," she began, cutting straight to the chase, "about this contribution you mentioned yesterday. I find it utterly outrageous. You made me humiliate myself in front of everyone, and now you expect me to pay for your perfectly fine field." "Brenda," I said calmly, "your perfectly fine field is my private property, and it now requires significant remediation thanks to your unauthorized event. We can either settle this amicably, or we can involve legal counsel. Your choice." She scoffed. "Legal counsel? For a few trampled blades of grass? You're being ridiculous. Brenda, the cost of reseeding, aerating, and restoring that pasture is not insignificant, not to mention the disruption to my livestock and my personal peace. I'll send you an estimate, and we can discuss it." "An estimate? I'm not paying a cent more than a token amount. And frankly, I think you owe me an apology for making a spectacle of me." Her audacity was truly boundless. "Brenda," I said, a slight edge entering my voice, "you trespass on my property, host a massive event without permission, and then demand an apology from me. That's not how this works. You owe me, and you're going to pay." The line went silent for a moment, and I could practically hear her fuming. "This isn't over, Mr. Peterson," she finally hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You may have won this round, but I'll make sure you regret it." And with that, she hung up. I chuckled softly. Oh, I knew it wasn't over. Brenda was a master of passive-aggressive retaliation, using the HOA bylaws as her weapon of choice. I fully expected a barrage of petty complaints and fabricated infractions in the coming weeks. True to form, the next few days brought a flurry of letters from the HOA, all signed by Brenda as chairperson of the Architectural Review Committee or head of Community Standards. One letter stated that my fence, which had been standing for 20 years, was now mysteriously out of compliance with a newly discovered height regulation. Another demanded I prune a shade tree near my driveway, claiming it was obstructing views, though it only obstructed the view of my own mailbox. Then came the truly laughable one, a notice that my horses, apparently, were creating excessive dust and a nuisance, and that I needed to install dust suppression measures in my pasture. I rolled my eyes. This was classic Brenda, petty, vindictive, and utterly absurd. I ignored most of them, knowing they were baseless. But the dust one particularly irked me. I was a rancher. Horses grazed. That's what they did, and I certainly wasn't going to pave my pasture to appease Brenda's imaginary dust allergies. I decided to pay her a visit. I found her in her immaculately manicured garden, pruning roses with an almost violent precision. She looked up as I approached, a smug, self-satisfied smile on her face. "Ah, Mr. Peterson, have you received my recent communications? I trust you're finally addressing those pesky issues." "Brenda," I said, my voice calm but firm, "let's cut to the chase. These issues are trumped-up nonsense, and we both know why you're sending them." Her smile vanished. "I'm merely upholding the community standards, Mr. Peterson. Something you seem to have a problem with." "No, Brenda. You're trying to harass me because you're angry about the wedding. And frankly, it's pathetic. The fence has been there for 2 decades. The tree is fine. And as for my horses creating excessive dust, they're horses, Brenda. They walk, they graze. This is a ranch community, not a sterile suburban cul-de-sac." She straightened, her eyes flashing. "The bylaws are clear, Mr. Peterson, and I, as a duly elected member of the board, am simply enforcing them." "Are they, Brenda? Are they really?" I leaned in slightly. because I've been doing some reading of my own. Specifically, the articles of incorporation for our HOA and the actual legally binding covenants and restrictions, and nowhere in those documents does it state that I need to pave my pasture for dust suppression, or that my 20-year-old fence is suddenly a violation. Her face paled slightly. Well, there are interpretations, board interpretations that don't hold up in a court of law, Brenda. And speaking of courts, I believe we still need to settle the matter of the damages from your wedding. I have an estimate here. I pulled a neatly folded paper from my pocket for the sum of $12,500 for pasture remediation, temporary fencing, and my time. Brenda gasped, clutching her pruning shears as if for support. $12,500. That's preposterous. I'm not paying that. It's a fair estimate, Brenda. And if you refuse, I'll add the cost of my legal fees to that sum when I file suit. Not against the HOA, Brenda. Against you, personally. The color drained from her face completely. She had always operated under the assumption that the HOA provided a shield for her actions, that she was untouchable. The idea of being personally sued was clearly a terrifying prospect for her. You wouldn't, she stammered. Oh, I absolutely would, Brenda. You thought you could use my property without consequence, and then try to punish me for standing up for myself. I'm not a man to be trifled with, Brenda. You picked the wrong rancher to mess with. I watched as her bravado slowly deflated, replaced by a look of genuine fear. She was cornered, and she knew it. The petty retaliations, the fabricated rules, all of them were suddenly dwarfed by the very real threat of a personal lawsuit. She had pushed too far, and now she was facing the consequences. I left her standing there, among her meticulously pruned roses, a picture of defeated arrogance. I knew I hadn't heard the last of her, not yet, but I had landed a significant blow, one that would make her think twice before launching another, unprovoked attack. The war with Brenda was far from over, but the tides were definitely turning. And the best part, I hadn't even unleashed my ultimate weapon yet, the one that would truly bring Brenda's reign of terror to a screeching, satisfying halt. The threat of a personal lawsuit hung over Brenda like a storm cloud, effectively silencing her barrage of petty HOA complaints. For a few weeks, an uneasy truce settled over our community. I still received the occasional icy glare from her at the mailbox, but the official-looking letters stopped, and a strained silence replaced her usual incessant chatter at community gatherings. The cleanup crew had finished their work, and with a significant investment of time and money, my pasture was slowly but surely returning to its former glory. I sent Brenda the invoice for $12,500 as promised. She didn't pay it. Instead, I received a carefully worded letter from her lawyer, stating that while Miss Higgins regretted any misunderstanding, she believed the requested amount was exorbitant, and that she was prepared to defend herself vigorously against any legal action. It was a bluff, of course, a final, desperate attempt to intimidate me, but I wasn't intimidated. I had been preparing for this. I knew Brenda's lawyer would try to drag this out, hoping I'd get frustrated and give up. But they underestimated my resolve. I had something up my sleeve, something far more potent than a simple lawsuit for damages. This was about more than just money or property. This was about ending Brenda's tyrannical reign once and for all. I scheduled a meeting with my own lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Sarah, who specialized in property law and had a particular disdain for overzealous HOAs. I laid out the entire story, from Brenda's initial invasion to her public apology and subsequent legal stonewalling. When I got to the part about her fabricating HOA rules and sending official-looking notices, Sarah's eyes lit up. "Mr. Peterson," she said, leaning forward, a glint of excitement in her eyes, "this is far more than just a trespassing case. Brenda Higgins has been operating outside the scope of her authority, potentially misrepresenting the HOA and engaging in systematic harassment. This could open a Pandora's box for her, and potentially for the entire HOA board if they've been complicit." "Complicit how?" I asked. "Well, if Brenda, as an elected board member, has been issuing these fabricated notices and enforcing non-existent rules, and the rest of the board was aware and did nothing to stop her, they could be held liable. There's also the matter of her misrepresenting the HOA's authority when she told you she had spoken to the HOA board about using your property for the wedding. That's a significant breach of trust and a misuse of her position." A slow smile spread across my face. This was it. This was the poetic justice I had been waiting for. "So, what's our move, Sarah?" I asked. "We don't just sue her for damages, Mr. Peterson. We challenge her authority, her position, and the very foundation of her power. We file a complaint with the state's Attorney General's office regarding her conduct as an HOA board member, citing abuse of power and harassment. We can also explore a defamation suit based on her implied claims that you are somehow violating rules. And then, we demand that the HOA board conduct a full investigation into her actions, or face legal action themselves for negligence." It was a bold, multi-pronged attack. It wouldn't just hit Brenda's wallet. It would hit her where it truly hurt her perceived authority and her standing in the community. It would expose her for the fraud she was, not just to a handful of wedding guests, but to the entire community, and potentially to state regulators. Sarah drafted the initial complaints, meticulously detailing every instance of Brenda's overreach, from the fence to the dust complaints, culminating in the unauthorized wedding. The formal notices were sent, not just to Brenda and her lawyer, but to every member of the HOA board. The silence that followed was deafening. The board members, many of whom had simply enabled Brenda's antics out of apathy or fear, were suddenly faced with the very real prospect of legal consequences for their inaction. I started receiving phone calls from other residents, some expressing their support, others, more timidly, asking if there was anything they could do to help. The word had spread like wildfire. Mr. Peterson was finally taking Brenda down. A week later, I received an urgent call from the HOA president, a harried man named George who had always seemed to live in fear of Brenda's wrath. "Mr. Peterson," he stammered, his voice tight with anxiety, "we need to talk. Immediately. This complaint to the Attorney General's office. It's serious. We've had an emergency board meeting." "I'm sure you have, George," I said, my voice calm. "Brenda's actions have put the entire board at risk. What do you propose?" We're asking Brenda to resign, effective immediately, and the board is prepared to cover the costs of your past year remediation. And we'd like to offer you a formal apology on behalf of the HOA for the distress and inconvenience you've suffered. It was everything I had wanted, and more. Brenda's resignation, a public apology from the HOA, and compensation for the damages, all without a lengthy court battle. "And what if Brenda refuses to resign?" I asked, testing the waters. "Then we'll remove her, Mr. Peterson. We have legal counsel reviewing the bylaws, and her actions clearly constitute grounds for removal. We cannot afford the liability she's created for the entire community." The satisfaction was immense. Brenda, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, was finally being dethroned. The irony was almost too sweet. Her desperate attempt to save face, to avoid a mere $12,500 payment, had cost her everything. The board held a special meeting, open to all residents, to formally announce Brenda's resignation and to issue their apology to me. The room was packed. Brenda, looking utterly defeated, sat in the front row, her usual confident posture replaced by a slumped, miserable slump. When it was announced that she had voluntarily resigned, a transparent euphemism for being forced out, a wave of palpable relief swept through the room, followed by a smattering of polite, almost celebratory applause. George, the HOA president, read a prepared statement, apologizing for the unfortunate incidents and assuring residents that new measures would be put in place to ensure such misunderstandings would never happen again. He then turned to me, extended his hand, and publicly thanked me for bringing the issues to their attention. I shook his hand, acknowledging the apology with a simple nod. I didn't need to gloat. Brenda's face, pale and drawn, was all the vindication I needed. The sight of her, stripped of her power, her authority utterly demolished, was a far more satisfying victory than any amount of money. The final nail in Brenda's HOA coffin came a few weeks later. Tiffany, the bride, and her husband sent me a lovely gift basket, along with a handwritten note. It wasn't just a thank you. It was an apology, genuinely heartfelt, for Brenda's behavior. They also included a small, framed photo from their wedding, a beautiful shot of them on the makeshift stage, with my ranch stretching out peacefully behind them. On the back, Tiffany had written, "The most memorable wedding ever. Thanks to you, Mr. Peterson, for showing us true grit and for putting Aunt Brenda in her place. We promise to ask permission for the next family event." I chuckled, hanging the photo in my office. It was a perfect ending. Brenda's grand unauthorized wedding had indeed been unforgettable, but not for the reasons she intended. It was unforgettable because it marked the end of her reign of terror, a dramatic, public display of karma, and a testament to the power of standing your ground against a bully. The community, freed from Brenda's oppressive grip, slowly began to heal. The HOA, chastened by the experience, became more transparent, more responsive, and less about control, more about actual community betterment. My ranch once again was a sanctuary of peace and quiet, its pasture green and lush, a silent monument. To the day a powerful Karen learned a very hard, very public lesson. And as for Brenda, she eventually sold her house and moved away, presumably to inflict her brand of community standards on some other unsuspecting neighborhood. Our community, however, breathed a collective sigh of relief, forever grateful for the day a rancher dared to stand up, not just for his property, but for everyone's peace of mind. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around. I've got more wild HOA tales coming your way.